نزدیک به 6 دهه رزم و نبرد سازمان مجاهدین خلق ایران با 2 دیکتاتوری شاه و شیخ، هر انسان آزاده‌ای رو به تحسین و حمایت از سازمان مجاهدین خلق ایران وامی داره. در این برنامه به گفتگو با یکی از این شخصیت‌ها می‌شیم. سفیر لینکن بلومفیلد، معاون وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا در امور سیاست نظامی در دولت جورج دبلیو بوش بوده. اما سالیان زیادیه که از نزدیک با مقاومت ایران و سازمان مجاهدین خلق ایران در ارتباطه. سفیر لینکن بلومفیلد شیطانسازی‌های ارتجاع و استعمار علیه مجاهدین رو مطالعه کرد و با اشراف به واقعیت مواضع و عملکردهای مجاهدین طی این سالیان به حمایت و دفاع از اون برخاست. آقای بلومفیلد کتابی درباره تاریخچه سازمان مجاهدین تحت نام مجاهدین خلق در بند تاریخچه‌ای تحریف شده نوشتند که نتیجه مطالعات و تحقیقات چند ساله او بوده. سفیر لینکن بلومفیلد مطالعات زیادی رو درباره سازمان مجاهدین و تاریخچه اون به عمل آورده. توضیحات سفیر بلومفیلد در مورد اینکه چرا دست به این تحقیقات زده جالب توجه.
11 years ago, after I had left government service, one of my functions was as a consultant to a Washington law firm as a non-lawyer. A group based in Northern California of Iranian Americans engaged the law firm to help get the MEK and the National Council of Resistance of Iran off of the American terrorism list. I was not a lobbyist, so I was not prepared to lobby my government. However, at the time, I was the chairman of a think tank in Washington, and I investigated what all of the think tanks and the Middle East experts were saying about the MEK. It was surprising that they didn't have much information, and they all repeated the same thing. The MEK, they said, was a terrorist group that had killed Americans in the 1970s in Tehran. It was a cult. It was Marxist and had no support inside Iran. I was then invited to go to the rally north of Paris in 2011. This was the 30th anniversary of events in Iran where the MEK and others had been promoting democracy and free elections and free speech and political dialogue, but Ayatollah Khamenei and the forces of his new constitutional dictatorship wanted to end all of the political dialogue. Mas'ud Rajavi called Iranians out into the streets on June 20, 1981, and in Tehran, 500,000 people turned out. In other cities, many more. And the regime of Ayatollah Khamenei opened fire on the Iranian people and began a reign of terror. I learned about this in Paris. I asked a lot of questions, and that is when I became interested in the true history of the MEK. As I reviewed the materials and the books and the pamphlets that the NCRI brought to my office, I realized that for a long time, they have been trying to persuade the U.S. government to take a closer look at the facts. And many of their publications had actual documents in the back of the book. There were letters from members of Congress and the Senate. There were resolutions from Congress. There were documents and press clippings and all sorts of original references, which I found very interesting. But what struck me the most is that the story that Washington believed to be true about the MEK was not consistent with the original facts. The more I looked at the actual reports and facts and congressional material from 20 to 30 years ago, I realized that something was not right. The facts did not align with what Washington believed to be true. It was more than a slight difference. It was a very significant difference. So I prepared a report at the law firm that looked at 10 different allegations. And without claiming to be an expert, because I was not an expert, I was able to include original documentation on each one of these subjects. And anyone who read the allegations and then looked at the original material would understand that something was not right. Someone was changing history. Someone was twisting the narrative. And this began my exploration of the full history of the MEK, which is now reaching 58 years. And I wrote in 2013 a brief book, a publication, which went through this history, including specific alleged terrorism acts, and showed what really happened, what was the true story, and showed the documentation and the proof and the photographs that undermined, it undermined the accounts of the official Department of State country reports of terrorism, which over a period of almost 20 years changed from one year to the next. And it showed that somebody inside the government was trying to rewrite history, and that other people in the government who should have known better were not paying attention. Or maybe they didn't know the history. So I felt it was my job to tell an untold story to Washington.
آقای بلومفیلد در سخنرانی خودشون در کهکشان ایران آزاد امسال به بررسی دروغ‌پردازی‌ها و شیطانسازی‌های رژیم علیه مجاهدین اشاره کرد و تاکید کرد که زمان بیان حقیقت فرا رسیده است. اما این حقایق در مورد مجاهدین و مقاومت ایران چه بوده؟ سفیر بلومفیلد این موضوع رو کمی کالبد چکافی کرد.
In my remarks to the Free Iran Summit this summer, I said that it was time for the West, for governments, for the media, to admit that they've been repeating a false narrative created by the Tehran regime for 43 years. The truth is much different. The truth about the regime, its vulnerability, its lack of legitimacy, and about the resistance, which has now survived for 58 years. What people don't yet understand is that this was a student group, an idealistic group of intellectuals who wanted to get rid of colonialism and monarchy and to establish a just society. Many of them were arrested in 1971, most of the leadership except for Mas'ud Rajavi, and most of the students who were involved were executed in 1971. And they left behind speeches in which they expressed their final thoughts to the military tribunals who executed them. And these speeches brought them great fame throughout the student population. The Mujahideen had a lot of prestige. Of course, the Shah created propaganda to demonize them. And so what people need to understand is that after the Shah fell and Khomeini returned, Mas'ud Rajavi and others were very active in promoting democracy and the idea that Islam equals freedom. This was the subject of publications and speeches and lectures until June of 1981, when Ayatollah Khomeini and his forces said no more, and they opened fire on the resistance, and they basically drove them into exile and killed and arrested tens of thousands of people in a reign of terror. The regime is trying to kill them. They have a branch of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, Section 312, which is dedicated to tracking down and killing members of the MEK. We have had incidents in the United States where colleagues of mine have been targeted for death. So I'm calling for human rights investigations, including of President Raisi, who, as I have recently said, and so many others, is directly guilty of sending thousands of innocent political prisoners to their death in the massacre of 1988. So he should be investigated and prosecuted. And Khamenei himself is directly involved in acts of terrorism, including the Argentina bombings in the 1990s and many more. All of them had to be authorized by the supreme leader. So we need to investigate the human rights abuses, take the testimony of the NCRI and MEK members, including at Ashraf 3, where they have exhibits showing what happened. And that, I believe, is the next chapter of the story.
بینندگان گرامی، با تشکر از اینکه تا این ساعت همراه ما بودید، برنامه ما در اینجا به پایان میرسه. خدا نگهدارتون.